Thanks, Megan. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm so happy to see so many people on a Friday afternoon. This is lovely. And of course, I wish that I could be there with you at UNM, but I am here wherever that may be. Just kidding. It's in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm going to share my screen here for you. And we'll look at some images today. So when Megan first approached me about giving a talk for the Honors College, I was really excited to hear about the work that you do because I am also an interdisciplinary scholar. My undergrad work was in comp lit, and then after that I worked in an art museum and then studied photojournalism, and then finally went back for a PhD in visual culture. So my work is not strictly art history. Actually, it's what I think art history should be. It's a more expansive consideration of the visual world, including things that are not necessarily considered art. So my research for this book was inspired by a similarly broad approach. In it, I look at all kinds of photography, from snapshots and school portraits to Instagram photos, as well as advertising, photojournalism, fashion, and more traditional art photographs as well. So as Megan said, I trace 50 stylistic trends through 175 years of practice, but I don't privilege any one kind of photography or photographer over any other. So the primary goal is to create a history of photographs and visual styles that were widely seen. So today I'm going to take you on a tour of some of those trends, including those that you submitted, which we'll look at the end. So most photographic rules appear so natural that they're thought of as nothing more than the necessary techniques that result in a good picture. And in fact, what we describe as a good picture is constantly changing, as you can see in this image of the proliferation of how-to manuals throughout the 20th century. The cycles that defined these trends were nearly as short-lived in the 19th century and early 20th century as they are today. So I think of these as before and after shots. You'll see that some of the rules change. Sometimes the same style goes from a good picture to a bad one, or vice versa in a very short period of time. So if you think back to the early 2010s and the proliferation of the Valencia filter, you remember that that's a really quick turnover. So looking back at some of those pictures, as well as these manuals, is like a time warp. So the rules for contemporary good pictures, such as the best angle for selfies, which is like always a high angle, right? Or the best light for for portraits, golden hour. Most of those rules are really recent adaptations. So in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to talk you through the emergence of some of those trends and their downfall. So their before and their after. So overall, I believe that breaking the rules is also an essential part of photographic practice, and that those rule breakers are often unnamed and even amateur photographers whose rejection of the status quo is really a crucial part of our evolving visual language. In 1912, Kodak began publishing a how-to series called How to Make Good Pictures. The series ran through the 1990s. Not only did the books offer technical suggestions, but they also established many of the occasions for photographing that are still prevalent today. The guidebooks recommended critical moments in heteronormative family life, from weddings and babies' firsts to vacations, holidays, and casual pictures around the home. Despite the large numbers of women and people of color involved in photography since the medium's earliest days, the instructional literature almost universally depicted white men photographers photographing their smiling white wives and children. In fact, the 1972 manual in the middle of this picture was the first to include Black subjects on the cover. So as these books make clear, the rules about good pictures tell us a lot more than just what makes a good picture, but they also tell us who can make one. When new trends circulate, they often do so first among photographers, both amateurs and professionals, and only later do they become admitted into the official industry standard how-to books. Many of these aesthetic changes are unauthored and their original uses are obscured. Sometimes they're pioneered by amateurs and seen casually by friends in slideshows or family albums. Sometimes they're lucky accidents, which are then picked up as a deliberate style by professionals and art photographers. And this is maybe that quintessential example of picking up the accident, which is the photographer's shadow in the frame, and Lee Friedlander uses it for artistic intent in Shadow, the picture from 1966. Aesthetic trends are named eventually in guidebooks, but their authorship still remains kind of amorphous. They're just gathered under this general description of good pictures. We don't necessarily refer to them by their maker's name or even the name of the style. And even Instagram hashtags aren't always useful for identifying stylistic trends. They often focus on content rather than style. As the Instagram account Insta Repeat makes painfully obvious, these lifestyle brands and influencers in the outdoor industry create pictures that are remarkably homogenous, even if their hashtags only list inspirational slogans and John Muir quotes. They don't describe the style of the pictures. So this account gathers pictures made by many different makers that are posted all over Instagram, and then Insta Repeat collages them all together to show their similarity. And here that similarity is usually a blonde hair, plaid jacket, canoe, blue water. And to all of us today, this should probably look a lot like the Taylor Swift new album cover. And that's probably no accident, right? She basically had that audience tested and approved more than 3 years ago. So it's easy to see changes across generations of photographs, but these aesthetic styles are rarely described during their initial periods of popularity. So for example, in the 1980s, the use of warm lighting for food close-ups in the advertisement at the left, and then in the more recent pictures, cool light and flat light of food photographs on Instagram, those are both considered the good pictures of their day. But those styles were rarely addressed at the height of their popularity. Instead, they were just described as good pictures. So change in photographic style is often attributed to technological developments. Major textbooks teach the history of photography as a history of technology. Especially in the 19th century, the medium is described by Beaumont Newhall as a history of what subjects were possible given the technological limits of the camera and its chemistry. So an opposition of, or there's another history to be told here, and I think that's an opposition to technology. And it started to emerge for me in the research that inspired this book, and that's motion blur. So the conventional story of photography shows it progressing from infuriatingly slow exposures of 30 minutes or more in its very earliest years to the improvements in chemistry that made it finally possible to record portraits by the 1850s. But still, it was slow. And so, for example, in this picture from 1862, you can see that the motion of the seated man and dog leaves this kind of streaky blur across the image area. So the dog looks like he's got two heads because he's moved during the exposure time. So most histories celebrate the invention next of dry plate technology, which eventually allowed even amateurs to record fast motion, such as jumping and running. And Edward Muybridge's improved mechanical shutters developed in the late 1870s seemed at the time to be the very apex of speed. But by the 1930s, Harold Edgerton pioneered the use of electronic flash, which made it possible to record even the motion of a speeding bullet. So for anybody who's taken a history of photography, I'm sure you've seen probably these exact pictures organized maybe in this exact way, that photography is the story of technological improvement, and one of the key areas is the ability to arrest fast motion. But what became obvious to me in my research all along this timeline, there were moments of resistance. In the 19th century, when photographers succeeded in recording the motion of steam trains, which were fast at the time, there followed criticism that those pictures looked too still. The pictures made the impression that the trains weren't moving at all. And the success of the photographic process in arresting motion, in effect, was rendering the accomplishment of the photographer moot. So the pictures they didn't contain that element of speed. So after the widespread publication of Edgerton's photographs in the 1930s and the increased availability of electronic flash on the consumer market after World War II, another backstep occurred in this representation of speed. And I describe this as motion blur, which is the result of panning the camera to follow a subject in rapid motion. So the technique and actually the name itself is borrowed from filmmaking. The photographer chooses a slow shutter speed, which then allows the background to blur while the moving subject remains sharply focused because the camera is panning along with it. So the panning trend with that background blur surged in popularity in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And here you can actually see that there's even been a fake blur added to the Dunlop logo in the background. So they're making things blur simply for people in the stands. It's so popular. Here also in the image at the right, the illustrator has recreated the look of blur in a drawing. There is no blur naturally in drawings. Or at left, there's a distinction between old style pervasive blur and more controlled motion blur in the bottom image. So this use of motion blur was justified at the time as everything from a more natural way of seeing or perceiving motion to a fitting aesthetic for the cultural upheavals of the 60s. At the time, no one described blur as a response to those overly sharp still photographs and enabled by consumer grade electronic flash. But I think this progression and regression is important. Only when photographic technology has overcome a particular limit or perceived failure can those accidental effects then be reintroduced for aesthetic gain. Like most trends, the overwhelming popularity of motion blur led to a critical backlash in the 1960s. Magazines debated a battle over blur and wondered whether it was a creative tool or sloppy technique. And I'm sure that phraseology actually sounds familiar to anyone using digital cameras today. Is it creative? Is it just lazy? These questions go on and on. So there's enormous anxiety in photography over technique and the limits of artistic freedom. So most articles concluded, like this one, that it is, quote, all too easy to blur a picture through sheer incompetence. Oh, sorry, it looks like I've lost a picture. The pattern of technological advancement followed by deliberate reintroduction of these accidents is something that I observe throughout the history of photography. So a number of those trends appear in the 20th century, motion blur, of course, but also the use of film grain and lens flare, which is the missing picture at right, but we will see more of in the Google slides later. But this pattern of forward motion and retrospective analysis is not limited to the 20th century. Even earlier trends in the 19th century, like soft focus and vignetting, also represented a return to former failures for aesthetic effect. So now I want to work backwards from some of the advice that's widespread today for taking good pictures. It's clear to me that photographic style is passed on through visual experience and not just in published written advice. But for the purposes of identifying established rules and recognized trends, I think written sources like magazines or blogs are extremely helpful. So with all the attention paid to selfies in the early 2010s, it comes as no surprise that advice proliferated for how to take a good selfie. And one of the rules that always made these listicles was the avoidance of the low angle view, or the up the nose view, as some people called it. Kim Kardashian even patiently explained her selfie practice for Cosmo. She said, quote, always take your selfie from above, angling down. I think there's nothing worse than when somebody wants to take a selfie and they take it from the angle down below, and they get some double chin action. In 2010, OkCupid ranked more than 7,000 user photos according to pose and number of messages received from potential dates. And overwhelmingly, the pictures that received the most attention were photographed from high angles. OkCupid even removed cleavage-bearing shots from the sample and still found that users who posted high-angle selfies received 50% more new monthly contacts than those who posted the second most popular pose, which was pictures taken in bed. So like most universals, though, the high-angle view turns out to be historically and culturally specific, no matter how ubiquitous the pose was on social media in the 2010s. As recently as the 1940s, low-angle shots were considered preferable. At the time, just after color film became widely available, instructional literature bemoaned American photographers' ineptitude with the new color film. The two chief offenses were color for color's sake and distracting colors. So photographers suddenly had to learn how to see the world in terms of hue and color contrast rather than just tonal values. Where light and shadow easily created separations between objects in black and white photography, contrasting colors had the tendency to stick out of otherwise subdued backgrounds. And that would then collapse the appearance of depth and overwhelm the subject's composition. So this had the greatest impact on portrait photography, where it was especially necessary to separate the subject distinctly from the background. Instead of receding into a shadowy or out of focus background, as had been widely recommended for black and white portraits, contrasting colors come to the fore, regardless of their relative sharpness. So the classic example is putting your portrait subject in front of a green bush that happens to have red flowers. The red flowers will pop and your subject will seem to disappear. So the solution to this problem of color contrast and distracting backgrounds was simple, according to the late 1930s and 40s guidebooks. They just asked that photographers shoot everything against the sky, which means take a low angle and look up at your subject with the sky behind them. So more than half the portraits in a book called Kodachrome and How to Use It made use of a low angle to frame subjects. The author and principal photographer explained that the greatest fault in the use of Kodachrome by amateurs is that the photographer fails to approach his subject from the proper angle and has a tremendous affinity for improper backgrounds. Instead, tilting the camera upwards and perhaps using a polarizing filter concentrates the eye on the figure and is undisturbed by any distraction. So you can see this in lots of guidebooks from this period, including the Kodak How to Take Good Pictures. The issue of camera angle and psychological advantage is often discussed in filmmaking, but less frequently in photography. So the dogma of the most flattering angle, which today we consider angling down, is really just a trend, and it changes with the decades. When I worked as a wedding photographer right out of college, I was taught to avoid low angles at all costs. We even carried step stools with us to get perfect high angle shots, no matter how tall our wedding participants were. But as soon as I started looking, most of these supposedly unassailable rules in photography undergo reversals. It's not just a low angle or a high angle, but even things like golden hour. So this is another apparently ironclad rule that I learned in photo school, and which I took to be a given, that people look best at golden hour, the hour immediately following sunrise or the hour preceding sunset. I was shocked to discover in the course of my research for this book that for most of the 20th century, golden hour did not exist. And that doesn't mean that the sun wasn't rising and falling. Instead, it means that amateur photographers didn't consider this a valuable time of day. They were advised to avoid the warm, low-angle light associated with sunset and sunrise. Only when this dramatic quality of light became recognized in the 1990s did the phrase golden hour achieve prominence in the how-to literature. And again, it's borrowed from filmmaking. So exposure guidelines were actually included in every box of Kodachrome since its 1936 debut. But these printed charts only guaranteed accuracy for pictures taken outside of golden hour, that is, during the middle of the day. Kodak said, quote, "Follow rigidly the exposure chart on the instruction sheet, and you will find, for instance, that outdoor pictures should be taken between the hours of 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. Before these hours, the light will cast a reddish or orange glow on the film." And that was not considered a good thing at the time. They especially advised against taking pictures of people during the hours of during golden hour. So while it was easy in the early years of Kodachrome to blame this difficulty on film's tendency to exaggerate saturated color, the problem wasn't entirely a technical one, as a few of the books recognized. One of these popular how-to authors, Fred Bond, wrote of photographing during the forbidden hours, quote, "If flesh tones appear badly sunburned, don't blame Kodachrome, it recorded what it saw." Until the early 90s, instructional guides instead recommended corrective filters to simulate normal daylight color balance for portraits taken during those extreme lighting conditions. The pejorative language used by these guidebooks to describe the effects of photographing people in warm light underlines the apparent threat that these pictures posed. For more than a century, photographic guidebooks, as well as the camera and film industry at large, assumed that their consumers were predominantly, if not entirely, white. Visualizing these assumptions, most guidebooks featured white models taking pictures of other white models in middle-class domestic spaces. And when authors described the effects of golden hour on skin tone, they clearly meant white skin, which had been used as the benchmark for accurate exposure by camera and film manufacturers since the medium's invention, as Lorna Roth and Sarah Elizabeth Lewis have described. Although the photographs of white models taken in golden hour light occasionally appeared in fashion magazines during the 70s and 80s, these pictures were usually limited to summertime subjects, or they were advertisements for sunglasses and sunscreen. It was not uncommon during the same period to see golden hour used by travel photographers to depict people of color. And here are two other examples: summertime subjects, predominantly white subjects. And these kinds of pictures would not have been made during other seasons. And that's not because the warm sun didn't occur during the winter, but because tanned skin was not valued at the time, and certainly not the extensive coloration that you could see in Kodachrome. But by the 1990s, fashion and advertising photographers began applying this golden glow to street scenes and other outdoor photo shoots, even for products unrelated to the sun and unrelated to the summer. By the mid-90s, the photographic literature was reflecting a major shift. Quite suddenly, the photographer's working hours were inverted. Now the midday hours from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. were entirely useless. And I'm sure you've heard this: don't photograph at noon. As Popular Photography advised in 1997, quote, "The quality of light during the last hour before sunset is better than the rest of the day put together." So as you can see, pretty quickly, all of these rules were inverted. This is a really obvious before and after. And then in the 90s, the phrase golden hour appeared regularly in all manner of periodicals, from local newspaper articles on how to take the best snapshots to advice columns of specialist photography publications. Nearly every one of these articles took time to point out that the phrase was borrowed from filmmaking, and the application of the moniker golden hour didn't occur until the effect was celebrated, and it gave it the aura of a trade secret. Whereas just 10 years earlier, it was common to recommend filters, especially in portraiture. By 1995, orange sherbet-colored warming filters and even warm balanced film were standard equipment in any photographer's bag. Cultural as well as technological changes contributed to this shift in photographic technique. While Black models appeared on runways and in high fashion advertising during the 70s and 80s, they were rarely cast in mainstream advertising for ready-to-wear brands until the mid-80s, when the international clothing brand Benetton introduced the United Colors campaign. Picturing models of many skin tones, all in the same advertisement, Benetton's stated concern was with promoting a standard of beauty that celebrated plurality. At the same time, these advertisements and their appearance in print demanded film and printing technology that could accommodate all skin tones, no longer favoring only the idealized light beige or pink tones that had so long determined film standards. It wasn't until commercial advertising accounts complained about film's inadequate representation of brown tones that research was undertaken to produce more brown-sensitive film stock. Varicolor 3 and the popular amateur film Gold Max were released in the 1980s and were described as having improved rendition of brown tones and expanded dynamic range. All of these so-called good pictures are tightly bound up with cultural prescriptions. Even when such judgments are silent, their influence can be felt in the ardor with which critics argue for one mode of picture making over another. The acceptance of photographic effects such as golden hour or high angle or distracting colors in portraiture required much more than simply learning how to anticipate film's objective rendering of the subject, but also how to think of those subjects, and sometimes ourselves, in more nuanced ways. There's no universally good picture, only those that appeal to their viewers at a given cultural moment. In other words, there's a before and an after built into all of these trends. There's a moment in which they're invisible and simply described as good pictures, And then there's the time after that when they've become not good pictures, but outmoded or outdated ones. So no matter what the rule books say, these rules are always changing. And now I'm going to turn to some of the emerging trends that you have discovered from hidden perhaps on your own camera rolls. So I'm going to quit this presentation. Megan, do you think we should take questions in between or head straight to Google?
I think you could take questions if you want. I can go ahead and open up the chat and see if people have questions now, if you'd like. Or would you? Either way is totally fine.
Let's see. I don't see any questions in the chat yet. So why don't I put that out there as a suggestion. If you have ideas and you have things you want to talk about, start adding those to the chat. And I'm going to share some of your good pictures now. Books submitted to this shared Google Doc. So thanks everybody for playing along with this game. I got a lot of pictures here and I'm so excited to go through them, and maybe I'll ask you to introduce your pictures as they come up. If you'd like. So we've got a lot of lens flare pictures here. Megan, is that okay? Can you see this?
I think I can see it, but it's not full screen yet.
How's that?
It's loading. Yeah, that's great.
Cool. Yeah, so fantastic lens flare photos here. This is another trend that was absolutely off limits in the early days of the history of photography and became popular in the 1960s, again, kind of borrowed from filmmaking. It creates a sense of authenticity. In filmmaking, it was used literally to suggest that this is being filmed on location, not in a soundstage. And I guess I'd be curious to hear if any of you who share these pictures are willing to describe like what appeals to you about lens flare here.
Feel free to go ahead and unmute yourselves if you'd like, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, and if not, you can put notes in the chat as well.
Yeah. Oh, okay, let me see. Let me fix that. Thank you, Stephanie. I see your comment.
Okay. Here's another wonderful one. And of course, lens flare here is created. You have these distinctive shapes, the little five-sided flares, which reveals the overlap of your camera shutter. This is light bouncing around inside your lens. And they become digital in some aspects too. Let's see if Stephanie wants to reply. Okay, cool. There are quite a few more slides here, so I'll move on. Shadow selfies, which I think is an emerging trend, and I'm happy to see a lot of these here. I think they're a fascinating way of portraying yourself in the landscape. And you know, there's a nice abstraction element. These are some nice examples too. And of course, if anybody wants to introduce their picture or describe why they think a shadow selfie is important, please do.
Henry, I see that you have an image. Do you want to talk a little bit about your shadow selfie?
No need. All right, we'll move on. Oh, I see.
Oh, you can't unmute yourself. That's so weird. Hold on.
So Steffi asked this question, which is great. When did they become a thing? They feel iPhone recent to me. So maybe 2007 and later. The thing that I find fascinating about them also is that if you go on a Google image tour or you use Street View, you'll notice that people are blurred out from many of these user contributed images, and yet their shadows are not. So people, or sorry, the algorithm doesn't recognize the shadow as a representation of a person. So the bodies are blurred out, but the shadows are not. And there's a great artist working with that right now. Her name is Bree Souders. Let's see. And so I saw a couple of questions in here.
Yeah.
A question from me about lens flare. Appreciates the effect and it contributes to the photograph. It kind of creates a chiaroscuro effect. Yeah, there's certainly an interesting lighting experience in it. Let's turn back to some of those if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, that's right. These ones especially, the lens flare kind of confuses the camera, I think, and the camera's software. It doesn't know quite how to expose the scene when you've got all this light bouncing around. All right. Yeah, and Fiona's saying here the abstractions and the freedom really draws your attention. Yeah, the abstractions in shadow selfies are fascinating. It's great to be able to see yourself in a different way. Cool, thanks. So drone photographs were not popular. I left this up. I think it's fascinating to me how similar they all look. So if you have a chance to look through some, the hashtag on Instagram will create a nice grid for you. Photos of photos. I find this fascinating. I'm sure lots of people have them in their camera rolls, even if you don't consider them your own photos. For a while, pictures of the little Kodak, is it Polaroid Instax, the tiny, tiny Polaroid images. Those seem to be popular only if you can tell that it's an Instax. So you don't want just the image, but you want the border and you want the location of it. So here on the left, definitely, it looks like a picture from a photo album. And on the right, this is a classic TV picture, which I will tell you, this is an interesting way of thinking of a photo. But television pictures were challenging to make when they first became popular in the 1950s, because the way the cathode ray tube and the scanning beam works, it's not a complete image immediately. So people were using shutter speeds that were too fast to capture the entire image. So it looks like it was easy to get this image. It looks, unposed and made probably with a smartphone. But back in the day, in the 1950s, you had to use a shutter speed of less than 1/60th of a second. Otherwise, you'd get an incomplete image. So thank you so much for submitting these. Let's see what's next. More photos of photos. I'm really curious about these. Are these photos or paintings? If Heather's here, just give us a note in the chat.
These are photos. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. During COVID, it's been really hard to get ink. And so I started collecting old printers and trying to make my own ink. I teach photography here in Taos, and so I've been experimenting with all kinds of garbage to print images on, and then trying to wheat paste onto things like tin or paper, or make my own paper, and then use the ink, but I'm having a hard time fixing the inks. So I've tried coffee and beets and mud and ashes. And so that's kind of what is happening right now. But some of the images disappear pretty quick. So I have to make photos of the photos before they disappear.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah. Thank you so much for telling us about that process. I was really fascinated by these. because, you know, you're tricking us also in using these frames because they look like historic images. It could be a daguerreotype or an ambrotype frame or a tintype even. And, you know, doubly with this possibly hand painted process or these, at least these unusual inks. It is really a wonderful like mix of times and media. So
The
cool.
texture that you're seeing is from having rubbed the paper, because sometimes I'm doing a transfer and then rubbing the paper, and sometimes the paper gets stuck in the image and creates the texture.
Yeah. And it's you've done a great job showing that in the photo of the photo. That's one of the things about photos of photos is that you get to see the materiality of the picture. It's different than a screenshot. It's a real object, as photos sometimes are. So thank you for sharing these. We got a Fuji Cam. All right, awesome. So this app, for those of you who maybe haven't encountered it, imprints the date on a digital camera photo. So just like our old 4x6 color prints from the 90s, this app will give you that sensation. Yeah, so if anybody wants to talk about Fuji Cam, if the person who submitted this is here, you're welcome to. Both of these two examples that we've talked through, Heather's previous example and this one, are interesting because they combine trends. And I am sure that some of you experience this in trying to decide where your picture should go. Is it just this trend or that trend? And I think that's the way photography works. We're constantly pulling aesthetic effects from previous decades or outmoded technology, or trying to invent new things. And so, you know, it speaks to a lot of different temporalities at once. Let's see what's next. Reflections. I love reflections because they're like photography, like the world making its own photograph, right? Like you see an image of something in the world, and then you make an image of that image. So here at the left, you've got a mirror reflection. And at the right, we've got some reflections in the pane of window glass. Actually, this looks like a mirror to me. Is that right? Is Ben here? Want to talk about it? No, not yet. Okay, let's see what's next. Actually, before we move on from reflections, I have to tell you that the cutting edge in computational photography is trying to remove reflections from windows, which I think is a great pity, because that is an area of interest for myself, but also for a lot of photographers. We love seeing reflections and getting to make abstract layers like Eugene Auger did in the early 20th century in Paris. And I think a lot of people did. That was a very popular style during the early pandemic. It was a way of showing our separation from people by including a reflection on window glass. So if you like reflections, watch out for future iPhone and Android apps. What's next? Bokeh. Does anybody want to talk about these images? We have a couple more coming up. These are all beautiful.
All these students are here. Taran and Matt and Alana, do you guys want to talk about these particular images?
Yeah, so mine is the one on the left with the bug. And I've loved bugs and stuff like my whole life basically. And I've always loved taking pictures of that kind of thing. And I think this style really lends itself to really focusing on like the subject matter of the picture that you want. And you can get really good detail on these little tiny like insects and stuff by focusing on it and like blurring out the background. And so I thought that style lended itself really well to that.
Great. Yeah, that is definitely one of the early recommended uses of selected focus was for wildlife and nature photography, where you get those messy backgrounds and you can't shoot everything against the sky. That's an amazing bug too, by the way. Anybody else, Matt or Alana, want to comment?
Sure. So I have never really used like a DSLR camera before, and we just learned in class how to blur out the backgrounds. And so I have this orchid on my windowsill, and I just tried a bunch of different ways like of angles of the orchid, and then I settled on this one from above because I liked how the flower like was kind of framed by the blurs of the other ones in the background. And it was just really exciting because I like never understood how people did this, and it's actually pretty easy to do. So
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think at least since the 1980s, 90s, this has been a mark of an artistic photograph. I think because it proves that you're using an SLR camera and not a point and shoot, and those were popularized in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so finally this definition of the term bokeh, which you probably learned in class, comes from a Japanese group of photographers who described it in opposition to other like photographic qualities like grain or grittiness. So you've got this this new technique that really makes your pictures look different than amateur pictures. Cool. And I know we have a couple more, so I'll keep on going. Yeah, speak up if you want to add anything. This is wonderful. I love this new angle.
So beautiful.
And everybody can identify the dog, right? And of course, this is, this is ideal shooting your subject against the sky, getting a nice clean background in there.
So this is my picture, and I actually wasn't intending. Originally, I did want to do angles, but what I wanted to do was to take a picture of, I have really high ceilings in my house, so I wanted to do an angle of a room from really, really high up because I feel like you never look at it like that. But I was sitting outside with my dog, and I just like randomly took this picture, and I just like liked it more. I don't know.
Oh, that's great. Your description of the room reminds me of a journal from the 1940s that recommended even had a picture of it, that a photographer like climb up on a bookcase in his house and photograph the downward angle. And this journal said that it comes from the fact that we finally had more amateur access to air travel. And so people were discovering new angles in their lives and seeking to apply them to everyday situations. So I don't know. Maybe don't try this at home, but maybe do. This is beautiful. Thank you for submitting it. Some more new angles, yes. Some classic New Vision, Moholy Naj here, Madeline. If you want to talk about them, you are free to. Nice color. I like the way these work together too. Next image. Motion blur, as you now know, one of my favorites. Fantastic use of multiple images and photo montage here. Andrew or Fiona, do you want to add anything?
So for this one, I was reading a lot on the filmmaker Maya Deren, and she was talking about how dance appears on the camera and the space around with it. So I was, this is part of like a film piece I was working on, but I did also several series of photographs in which I was exploring how to fill a space with motion in the way that the audience can still capture it. And I had a lot of fun doing this. It's rather difficult to time it though, and then I had to run and spin because I was working alone in quarantine. But
yeah, that's right. These are fantastic, and what a great choice of backdrop that allows you to have that real crisp, sharply focused background with the blurred subject. I love Maya Deren too. Cool. Andrew, do you want to add anything? Okay, we'll move on. Thank you to both of you. And golden hour. Awesome. Josue, are you here and do you want to talk about this?
I don't think he is here today.
All right. Yeah, golden hour was such a fascinating discovery for me in my research that I was trained on it and love it. And I had never anticipated that it was only a recent discovery, that it was actually breaking the rules. Cool. And Heather has submitted this hipstamatic tintype. Another way of adding some surface texture. I think hipstamatic, which was the precursor to instamatic, was invented to cover up the poor quality of the early iPhone cameras. They had such low resolution and pretty poor representation of dynamic range that hipstamatic took, and this is actually their company tagline, we take a bad image and make it worse. Is that what they said? I can't remember exactly, but they were embracing the limitations to make something that felt historic. So here, adding some selective focus or blurring of the lens at the edges, some aberration. Heather, do you want to talk about these two?
Yeah, so I've been teaching photography here in Taos for the past 10 years, and our school can't really afford cameras, although many of my students have iPhones, which is odd, but they do. And so we experiment with a lot of different apps and make these photos and then again print them out with handmade inks. And we've been having these rituals during COVID because I can only meet with one student at a time. So I bring a bag of costumes and we go to a location. I open the bag, the student gets dressed, and we make images with an iPhone. And
yeah, wow, that's incredible. And I love that you're taking this thing that was meant to make digital photography have more materiality, and then you're giving it back that materiality through your printing. So cool.
It kind of feels dark roomy without the dark room.
Right. Yeah. Wonderful. And some blur and layering. Great. So we added just got a couple more. Long exposure. Fantastic work. Michael, do you want to comment? All right. I think, do we have any more? Censored by social media. Is that because you tagged this, Beaver?
No, I didn't tag it. I think one of my friends might have gotten upset by it, but yeah.
Do you want to explain it?
This is just something that showed up where like in the backyard where the cat likes to ask to be let in. So I assumed that he had caught it, which is quite the achievement because he's he weighs 24 pounds. So but I thought it was really interesting. So I was pairing it with like plants and stuff like that and giving it a little photo shoot.
Yeah, photography is wonderful for memorializing, right? No matter what it is. Yeah, and censored by social media, Megan and I were talking about this before, what a wonderful category, because it sometimes encompasses things that you would never expect. And it also reminds us that social media is not the open and democratic place that we might sometimes say it is. So thank you for sharing that one. I think we're at the end of the presentation now. Yes. All right, so if anybody else has more questions, let's hear them.
I feel like your presentation has done a really interesting job of like pointing out the relationship between kind of the current cultural moment that one may be in while they're making an image and the values and even techniques that are utilized. And I'm wondering like what you think, if you look into your crystal ball, like what you think about these new trends that are happening now and how that sort of maps onto cultural values like in this moment with some of these kind of newer trends that you were looking at. Like, do you have hypotheses about like, what this may mean culturally in terms of some of these different approaches?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's absolutely my interest in this kind of photography is what does it say about the people who made it and wanted to look at it? And I think oftentimes amateur photography is ignored. It's called, snapshots are called boring pictures because they all look the same. but the more you look at them, you realize that they maybe all look the same in one moment, but they don't look all the same in the next. So yeah, there are a lot of choices that we make, even if you're just taking a picture of a birthday party. So yeah, one of the trends that interested me most in the time of COVID is this use of window reflections. And I think that was really clearly trying to show separation, especially in the very early parts of the pandemic, when photojournalists were tasked with representing, essential workers or people who were sick. As everybody knows, on social media, there would be an enormous backlash to someone taking a portrait up close in a situation where they shouldn't have been, when social distancing rules were in effect. So I think the reflections on window glass was a way of ensuring that distance, and literally ensuring the distance that was necessary. So to crystal ball, think about future trends. I think computational photography is only going to increase. And that is already evident in pictures that we saw today. There was that night mode. I think Matt took the night mode picture of the phone. So the software in the camera is automatically combining a number of images taken during one moment, and then averaging them together to create the best possible exposure. And there are lots of different ways that can go. And for me, I want to know who's deciding what the best possible exposure or the best possible anything is. And if you're somebody who edits pictures on their phone, you can see I'm looking at it. Somebody who edits their pictures on their phone, you're always looking at, is the auto crop and rotate exactly what I want? And 9 times out of 10, it's not. So I'm worried about the loss of control that computational photography promises. I think that even, I want people to be able to determine what their own good pictures are. And I don't want to follow the rules that were set in 1950s, 1960s guidebooks that were written by white men at Kodak. And to be frank, those are still the people that are in charge of computational photography programs at Google, at Apple. I don't know about Samsung. I do know about Adobe. So I'm curious about how these things will change what we get to see in the future, and if we think that that's really the representation of ourselves that we want. Dark, sorry. So Stephanie has a question. What are your thoughts about the role of technology? You've mentioned loss of control. What about things like iPhones versus GoPros versus DSLRs versus analog cameras, digitized, for example? Yeah, technology is really interesting because a lot of photo historians are resistant to histories that only tell the history of technology. And I totally agree with that. I think what's most interesting about technology is how often photographers work against it. So, where do we refuse night sight? For example, in California and in New Mexico too, there were tremendous wildfires this year. And I don't know if you got the same kind of red skies that we got here, but there was this day in San Francisco when the whole sky was red, though the fires were still more than 100 miles away. And the iPhone was not capable of representing this in a way that was accurate to the experience. So I think having control and resisting those technologies that are in place to make good or better pictures is really important, simply in representing what we actually see. Does that address your question, Stephanie? If not, you can add some more in the chat.
Oh, good. I'm able to unmute. Yeah, it did. I'm just fascinated. It sounds like you are as well, with this resistance and acceptance. And, I think we've all heard about the iPhone Android wars, and how, I've certainly heard about folks buying an iPhone over an Android because of its capability to take better photos, quote unquote. And so I'm fascinated, and I have been for some time. And also, one of my questions was that taking analog photos and then digitizing them later, right? And so that resistance is always there. So I'm just fascinated by that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, right. Absolutely. There's a, a war in representation. Which pictures look better? What can the camera do? But also, how does it choose to represent reality? And it's actually not that different from different film choices in analog cameras. So if you wanted like really rich, saturated greens, you'd choose Fujifilm. If you wanted like pink skin tones, you would choose Kodak. So there are definitely some holdovers from the analog world into the digital. So I see one more question here from Henry about LEDs as one of these emerging photographic trends. And I wonder, maybe could you add a little bit more? Are you thinking about like what people take pictures of, like flashing LEDs out in the world?
I was more thinking of like this trend that you see on social media of people using RGB lighting and like very colorful aesthetics in photography. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, the colorful aesthetic is super interesting. It reminds me of advertising photos. They're so like very bold, super saturated colors, which look great. And this speaks to Ron's point. They look great on these screens. These screens are super saturated and bright. And I think that's a place where there's crossover between the technology and the images that are being made. That's like, it's a chicken and the egg question, but we're making pictures that look good here and maybe not in a lot of other places. Maybe they look good on billboards, but they don't have the same kind of subtlety, which is not at all to say that I don't love those colorful images. Natalie Crick is one of my favorite photographers, and she uses incredibly saturated, bright, solid backgrounds. Which is, I think, some of the images that you might be talking about, Henry. If not,
what was the name of that artist with all the colors?
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
And Steffi is talking about UNM researchers working on LED and lasers. Is this Daniel Fiesel's lab? So they can perfectly represent.
Yes, he was part of this big program that was first called Smart Lighting, and then was called LISA, and it's continuing mostly through it's school in Albany and Troy, New York, and Rensselaer, and then Polytechnic, and then a little bit with UNM. It also affects how plants grow. You can control the lighting for how plants grow and how people sleep. So not only how things look under different lights, but they're taking out all the lights in the space station because they're fluorescent, and they're replacing them with LEDs, and they're trying to see if they can make astronauts sleep better up there because they only sleep 5 or 6 hours a night. There may be other reasons for that, but anyway, they are changing the colors with LEDs. There's actually, UNM has a room in the hospital where they do experiments with that on poor students.
Cool. So I guess some of these lights are being used in photography too, right? To create a clear, bright, very white, balanced light.
Yeah, and the other thing that was kind of cool in one of the studies they did is they took their graduate students who had been raised in China and those who were raised in the United States, and they could all agree on what, by weighting the amount of each particular red, green, blue, and I don't know what the fourth one was, but I think you can just do it with 3. What looked natural. The percentages of each that made something look really natural in solar, like the regular solar spectrum. But the students who had been raised in China liked their whatever it was a lot more saturated. So there were cultural preferences for the proportions of the different light in terms of look, what looked more preferential to them. They all agreed on what looked natural, but they had different preferences in terms of saturation.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, environment trains us just as much as pictures do.
Yeah.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so much. This was such a lovely talk and so informative in terms of just the arc of like these changes that have taken place in the short history of photography. So many different movements. Thank you so very much.
All right, thanks. Thanks for being here. Thanks for having me.